Everyone has opinions on who is the best driver in F1 history. For most people, it depends on which era you grew up in as to whether you think either Lewis Hamilton, Michael Schumacher, Ayrton Senna, or Alain Prost, Jim Clark, or Juan Manuel Fangio is the greatest of all time. I actually contradict that idea, as despite being born in 2004, the number one in my opinion is the late Jim Clark, whose F1 career came 4 decades before I was even born. It gets even worse on my supposed retro bias, as my next best Grand Prix picks were Fangio in second and the pre-war racing legend Tazio Nuvolari in third. However, those debates are long and convoluted, and despite having a wealth of statistical data and anecdotes from competitors of yesteryear, there will never be a way to unequivocally decide who is the GOAT of F1. So that's not what I'm going to try and do today in this video, as I've already done both driver tier lists and top 10s before on this channel. So instead, I'm going to focus on drivers who aren't at the top of their game, but instead fill up the bottom of the pile. Now, the debate over who is the worst driver in F1 history is as equally complicated to the GOAT debate, as most channels don't have the benefit of knowledge, especially stretching back into the 50s and 60s as some others do. Thus, stories may get misconstrued as they leave out a great amount of crucial detail. For example, there are some who look at the fact that Luca Badoer made 58 career entries without scoring a single point and use it against him, without realising that Luca's 3.5 seasons in the 1990s with the likes of Minardi, Forti and Lola were never likely to yield any results. Even with the attritional races that era often saw, the idea that Badoer's unwanted points problem reflects on his driving ability ignores the context his performances came in. There were several times he was in a point-scoring position, most famously at the Nürburgring in 1999, when he was running a remarkable 4th before a mechanical failure forced him into retirement, leaving him at the side of a road in tears, ruining what could have been. Those sources may also point to Luca's Ferrari stint in 2009, where he failed to perform to the level of his competition. However, not only do many underestimate the effects of being out of full-time Grand Prix racing for 10 years, even if he had been testing, before being expected to jump back in without ever having driven one of the 2 circuits he drove on, but they ignore the fact that Badoer's replacement, Giancarlo Fisichella, who had a reputation for doing well in the midfield and outperforming bad cars, also failed to score points on such a short notice. Maybe the example of Luca Badoer then is a perfect representation of why some of these claims made by some channels are a bit misleading. I'd just like to point out, by the way, it's not all the F1 social media guys, and it's mostly brain-rot Instagram and TikTok Drive to Survive fans who don't know any F1 history before 2018, but maybe we shouldn't treat what they say as absolute fact, because sometimes it's easy to read past the actual truth to a story. And I will move away from being negative for a second, as there are many videos like those about Yuji Ide, Taki Inui, or Jean-Denis Delatraz, for example, where creators acknowledge that while their bad performances were in fact awful, they do fairly explain the circumstances these problems happened in. Whether it's an inexperienced driver moving from the likes of Formula Nippon or French touring cars like Ide or Delatraz, or just an also-ran in the junior series with a boatload of cash paying their way into Formula 1 like Taki Inui, it's not all blurred in the lines of history. However, this long intro is a segue into the topic of today's video, as I'm going to document the story of a driver who's been misrepresented as awful, or potentially even the worst F1 driver ever, despite not being as bad as his record suggests. I hope I haven't just alienated the entire Formula 1 content creation community by slagging off a lot of them. It's not everyone I'm talking about, I promise. Please don't kill me.
Juan Manuel Fangio is in the lead on the last lap of the German Grand Prix.
Jim Clark drives the Formula 1 Motorsport to victory on the racetracks of the world.
And look at that! Out that, colossally, that's Mansell! That is Nigel Mansell! Alain Prost has taken the advantage. Senna is trying to go through on the inside, and it's happened immediately! This is amazing! Senna goes off at the first corner!
And I've got to stop, because I've got a lump in my throat.
The story of our wrongly interpreted driver starts on the 14th of October 1921 in County Durham, England, at his birth, obviously. Although Alpes grew up in England and was in the British Army, serving in India, Rhodesia, which is the modern-day Zimbabwe, and Egypt in the Second World War, after the war, he emigrated to Canada and became a commercial illustrator/artist while dabbling in motorsport business. During the 1950s, Pease started his own racing career and despite starting relatively late by modern standards, he soon became a legend of Canadian motorsport, which was probably a little bit easy considering Canada wouldn't have any Formula 1 drivers until 1961, and none with more than 10 starts until 1969. And no, I'm not acting like F1 is the be-all and end-all, it's just usually participation in the top tier of motorsport indicates presence on the world stage. Peace had a very good time in national and regional championships, winning pretty much every single racing class in Canada, driving a range of cars from MGs, Lotuses, Austin Healey's and Lolas. Okay then, a range of British cars. His most impressive achievements included winning the Sundown Grand Prix of Endurance at Mosport in 1964 alongside co-driver Don Kindry in an Austin Healey 3000, while he also won an hour-long race in an Austin Cooper, as well as some races in an MGB. On his debut driving a Formula A Lola T140 in the Canadian Road Racing Championship, he came third at Mosport, although he had at one point crashed while fighting for second. He competed in the 1964 12 Hours of Sebring driving a frog-eyed Sprite, but retired due to rear axle failure, then came back the next year driving an MGB, and finished 6th in class paired with the American Brad Pickard. He also saw success driving a Castrol-sponsored Lotus 47, and had actually lobbied the Canadian Automobile Sports Club to allow sponsorship on its cars, a plot which was successful. The next part of his career is actually his F1 debut. Castrol, his main sponsor, pushed for him to make the jump from sports cars to open-wheelers, despite his extensive lack of experience driving open-wheeled race cars. He entered only his home Grand Prix in 1967, a practice common for many local drivers, especially those in the English-speaking world, and made his first start at the ripe old age of 46. He was driving an Eagle T1G, which had taken Dan Gurney to a win earlier in the year in the Belgian Grand Prix, and despite his lack of experience, didn't qualify last. He put himself ahead of 3 other local drivers, although admittedly one of those, the American Tom Jones, was 29.5 seconds down on pole sitter Jim Clark. However, looking back at this, it's not unusual for local drivers to struggle in poorly maintained machinery, something Peace can attest to. At the start of the race, he lost 6 laps because his car wouldn't start and he needed a battery replacement. Nonetheless, he kept going and got back out on track, but spun at a part of the track furthest away from the pit lane and his car wouldn't restart. Undeterred, instead of just retiring, he ran the few miles back to the pit lane, uphill and in the rain, collected another replacement battery, then ran back down and installed it at the side of the track. After the biggest baptism of fire, or should I say lithium, Pease was unclassified in his first F1 race, having finished 43 laps down on race winner Jack Brabham. However, we can forgive this bad result as he literally had to do roadside DIY twice during the race. He returned for the 1968 Canadian event, which was now being held at Mont Tremblant while still being backed by Castrol, but this arguably went worse than last time. Driving the same Eagle chassis, he qualified 15.8 seconds away from the pole time and failed to start the race because his engine crank refused to start the car up. Determined to find out why, Peace single-handedly stripped the engine down and found it was being jammed by a misplaced Allen key. So in his first F1 start, he was shafted by awful reliability, then in his second start, he was shafted by awful reliability. His third start would come back at Mosport in 1969. His car was now 3 years outdated and had been sitting in the museum for several months at an exhibition in Montreal. Despite his car having literally been a showpiece for punters to look at for a little while, Peace dragged his outdated chassis to 17th on the grid, ahead of 3 drivers. On the first lap, he made contact with Silvio Moses Brabham, which caused the Swiss to spin off into retirement. It seemed the Brabham driver had misjudged just how slow Peace's ancient Eagle car would be, and upon approaching his slow car, was unable to react in time, so he swerved to try and avoid him. This seems eerily familiar. Then, further into the race, he touched wheels with the Matra of Jean-Pierre Beltoire's, which damaged the Frenchman's suspension. He'd apparently been holding up several of the leaders while being lapped, although I can't find a verifiable source saying exactly who he blocked. What I do know is that when he defended from Jackie Stewart, the Scots team manager, Ken Tyrrell, demanded Peace be disqualified to the race officials. Talk about interfering with the stewarding process. But that FIA to team radio being televised in 2021 is okay. Admittedly, Peace had only completed 22 of 45 laps, but considering his car's less than impeccable reliability record, I wouldn't be surprised if the reason he was that slow was because his engine fell out. He was then disqualified after Tyrrell's protests, but another detail not mentioned by most is that on some results, the reason for disqualification was, quote-unquote, driving too slowly, indicating the onus was on Pisa's bad driving, but elsewhere it listed the reason as simply insufficient speed. Since that infamous race in 1969, and especially with the advent of social media, Pisa's been a collective laughingstock in the world of Formula One, with clamours of mocking cries pointing out just how slow he was. And yes, even the most skilled of defensive lawyers wouldn't be able to deny that literally being half the average speed of your competitors is anything but slow. But if you look at his other two races, and his qualifying performances, he wasn't as bad as the results sheet shows. Was he a world-beating, champion potential driver who's been misrepresented as an idiot? No, he wasn't the best, or even a very good driver, at least not in F1, but he was by no means on the level of Yuji Ide, Jean-Denis Delatraz or Taki Inui. Even after his mediocre F1 stint, he made a career in F5000 and Formula A before retiring in 1988, aged 67. He was a pioneer of Canadian motorsport and was inducted into the Canadian Motorsports Hall of Fame in 1998, having been recognised for his sheer amount of race wins in national and regional events in the 1950s and 60s. Pisa's collective reputation as a laughingstock is unfounded. However, it is an indictment of modern Formula One fans believing that any driver is only measurable by their skills in F1 and not in any other category. Thus, drivers who may have won in other series, such as Paul Di Resta or Sebastian Buemi, simply get brushed off as F1 rejects, despite being very successful elsewhere. Let's also not ignore that Pisa was literally pushing 50 years old when he was driving in F1, far past his prime, so I think not only was he thrown into the deep end in uncompetitive machinery, he was far better than many people make out. Anyways, with that being said, I think that wraps up today's video. I hope you enjoyed me discussing the underrated career of Al Pisa, and if you did, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe to see more content from me in the future. Big shout out to my Patreon subscribers, Andy Lamberts and Ayman Al Dowdy, and as usual, if you'd like to support the channel financially and get early access to videos, please subscribe to my Patreon for as little as $1 per month. Without further ado, I'm Nedzo, and I'll see you all later. Bye!